let's start with the personal. Always start with the personal. You were previously CFO at Auto Trader, aiming to be CEO there. Why did you want to switch to the CEO role?
Oh, I think by the time I left Auto Trader, I was a really bad CFO in that I spent all my time telling everyone what they should be doing differently, but had never actually been in the firing line myself. And so sometimes what happens then is you become someone who's always the commentator and never the player. And so I wanted to see, could I do it? Could I put myself in the line of fire and actually deliver the outcome?
So that zeal, that desire to step up, is it as a form of responsibility, or to see the consequence of action having an effect?
Probably mostly frustration. You know, I really don't like things that are done badly. You know, I can't go to the John Lewis canteen at High Wycombe because it just drives me insane at how inefficient it is. So I think that when you see people doing something that could be so much better, then I feel, let me have a shot at that.
I'm rather relieved we got the mic to work on that basis.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, you were looking at me thinking, oh my God, this is really bad news.
I'm happy to shout.
But then you had this frankly it's like weird experience, which I'd like to talk about, which
Sure.
was that you were the interim CEO. You applied for, you know where this is going, you applied for the permanent position, and they turned you down.
Yeah, this is an Auto Trader. So I'd been interim CEO for a year. And then they appointed someone else who was the chairman's best friend from university. Not that I'm saying anything, right?
Just FYI.
Yeah, just like in the parenthesis. And a week after he started, he asked me to leave. So.
Wow. I will just push on this personal point. How did you respond to that personally? That's quite the setback. Did it go to your confidence?
I did 2 years of therapy, so it had a massive impact on me, and I had done a really good job optically in the business, and I'd done all the things that happened, and so I found it really, really challenging. And I think I just got divorced as well, and I was having a bit of a crisis of confidence. You know, I was 39, turning 40, had 3 young kids under, 6, 7, had just lost my job, having done a good job, and was thinking, I'm never going to work again. And I remember my therapist saying to me, just work out what's the absolute minimum that you need. And then that's your worst case scenario. And from that position, you've got nothing to lose. And so from a personal resilience point of view, that was a really useful exercise, because you stop being scared of what might happen, because you've already worked out, I'm okay if the worst thing that happens is I never work again. I'll be fine, I'll work in Tesco, but crazy as this all sounds, and I'm sharing it because the madness that goes on in our head goes on in everyone's head, and so I think it's worth kind of, being honest about some of the madness that happens.
It's extraordinarily honest, because on the whole, most people tell a success story from the pinnacle of that success, looking down as though it was preordained and we live our lives forward and understand it backwards and all that stuff. And this isn't. This is but there's then
exactly opposite.
But there's then another weird. I wish I could think of another word for it. So you went into Future as a part-time CFO. 10 weeks later,
CEO full time. Yeah.
The read across from that. What on earth happened, and what was going on in your mind at that time?
So I think after I had left Auto Trader, and literally he asked me to leave and terminated my contract. So I was like out a week after he joined, and I was going through all this kind of, what am I going to do with my life? And I thought, maybe I'll just not be executive. Maybe I'm not very good at it. There are parallels here, I think, with where I am just now. And consequently, I decided to go and be non-executive, and I thought I'll build a portfolio and I'll have a bit more balance in my life, and that's how I'll make this work. And then a banker, Numis, reached out and said, would you be interested in joining Future? And I was like, no. Why would I want to do that? First of all, I don't want to be an executive. Second of all, I don't want to be a CFO. And third of all, if I did want to do those things, I wouldn't want to do it at Future. And
the latter, why not?
Because it had such a bad rep. As a media company at that point, it had a reputation as being troubled, right? However, life, and this is a really important thing, life's taught me to always take the cup of coffee. Never say no. Have the conversation, because you just don't know what's around the corner. And so I had the cup of coffee, which then led to, well, why don't you come and be our CFO part-time? And that's a bridge from full-time executive career. I was a bit broke. That lets me kind of like emotionally recover myself and then work out what I want to do. And that seemed to work for Future, and that worked for me. So that was the plan what does it say? Man plans and God laughs, right? So 10 weeks later, I was full-time CEO.
But during that, I don't want to be too granular about it, but during that 10 weeks, you obviously got to see the numbers, you got to see the state of the business, and I'm imagining it was materially worse than you had thought. And then suddenly, so there you were with all that had recently happened to you, this role which is part-time for a company you didn't especially want to work for, the figures were worse, and they asked you to be full-time CEO.
I know.
Why did you take it?
So I think that if you're a director of a company, no matter how small or large, you have a responsibility to the people who are part of that company, be it the employees or the people who have lent to you, be that your creditors or anyone who's invested in you. And I think that as a director, whether I was part-time or not, I still had that responsibility. And what it was really obvious to me early on in Future was people cared deeply about this company. There was a real over-indexing on like Future and what it could do and what it stood for and the product it had. And then it had these shareholders who had backed it through a series of very challenging profit warnings. And so when asked to step up, I mean, my assumption was it was a workout, that we were going to kind of work out how to kind of break the business up, give the shareholders back their money and preserve as many jobs as we could through the process. I didn't really think that you had a choice. If you accept the position of being a director of a company, then you accept the good and the bad. And honestly, I didn't want the job. And this is a quirk of my career. I had got some non-execs by this point because I was going to go plural. So I was planning on leaving. So I kept my non-execs because I thought, well, they were quite hard to get. And I was still kind of having this kind of like, no, employ me nonsense going on. So I better just hang on to these jobs in case I can't get any more. Which meant that actually for the whole 10 years, I basically had 2 careers because by the time I had worked out, I was probably staying at Future and I quite liked it. I had got used to having these non-exec jobs, but I'd said to the chairman, 2 years. I'll give you 2 years and then I'm going back to my game plan 10 years later, right?
So, I mean, you didn't really know what you're getting into. It's almost the definition of our strapline, the future is unwritten, and you were having to write it. So when you came into this business, which, for all its legacy, history, whatever, was in a tough place at that point, how did you seek to prioritise what needed to be done? And also, how close was it to going at that point?
Oh, Richard's in the audience and he'll know because he was there at the time. It was like we had the bank's chief restructuring team in, and if you've ever had the misfortune to have that experience, you'll know how close it was. So the bank had decided that we needed to be supervised by someone full-time who told me, to this day, it scars me, oh, your bad business is my good business. He was charging us £5,000 a day to tell us how to suck eggs, right?
It's an ill wind.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah.
And so I had these weekly meetings with the bank, and so the priority became, I've got to get rid of the bank. I've got to pay the debt off, because if I don't pay the debt off, we're dead. And I've got no choices then, and so this man was bleeding us dry, the bank were breathing down our neck, and this was when we were still in Marylebone, I used to go out and walk around the square, there was like a garden square, after I'd see the bank, and I would be like, literally like, pulling leaves off trees, those poor trees, with just like frustration and anger about all the things you couldn't say when they treated you so badly when you were trying to save a business. And so we sold a couple of the assets, and I didn't want to do that, but I wanted to keep the business. And so I think one of the things about being a leader is you make tough choices. We can't have everything the way we want everything to be, and so therefore our job is actually to not shy away from that, but to lean into it. And so we sold the cycling business, which was probably the only part of the business at that point in time that I actually personally had any interest in. And we sold the craft business. And that allowed us to pay the bank off and put £10 million in the bank. And so suddenly it's like, okay, from here, we can now build a plan.
And you've described that as almost like being a startup or running a startup. So there's a sort of paradox here. That business then was, 20, can't do the maths, 28 years old, something like that.
Yeah, something like that, yeah, 29.
Order, but quite a long time, not a startup, and yet you approached it like that. So tell us what that was like. Was there almost a blank sheet of paper? You'd clear the debt, clear the Aegean stables, whatever it is, and now it's go. What was the go bit like? Yeah,
and so I think one of the things we did during that period was create some values, and it's not that Future didn't have values, we just hadn't written them down somewhere. And one of the values that still resonates with me today is we were proud of our past, but excited about our future. And I think that was kind of the pivotal kind of change, which was was an amazing business and has amazing content and should be exceptionally proud of everything that got us to that moment. But we had to look forward. We had to think about what did it need to be going forward. What we loved was the content and the specialism, then what we had to do was lose the constraint of the old business model. And so we spent a bit of time over about 6 months running these workshops about, I talk about why would you invent this business? Would I invent Future today? And actually, if the answer had been no, we should sell it and give everyone back their money because you're just prolonging the inevitable. But I was like, no, we should invent this business because we've got this fantastic content, all these talented people who care passionately, but the business model doesn't work anymore. So our question became, who will pay for this? And so often what we do in business is we start off with what we want to create rather than who's the customer. And so we had to kind of think about, where's the customer here? Because if I can't identify a customer, then I haven't got a business.
Did it almost help that because Future was in such a parlous state, and you've been very clear about that it was almost liberating? You could almost do anything, because it's not quite a blank sheet of paper. It's like, bloody hell, we've just got to figure this out. And was the opportunity to communicate through the team, we are going a different course.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you have some history there as well, so you know the story. But I think by the time we got to £27 million market cap with no profit and no cash generation, the shareholders were of the view which was, we've written this down. Whatever you do now is just upside. It was like betting it on black or red. And so I actually think success is harder, because when you're successful, you have to keep being successful. It's a different type of pressure. But when you are failing or when you're starting out, you can only win. It couldn't get any worse, right? And professionally for me, it couldn't get any worse either at that moment. So I think where I was coming at this personally, combined with where Future was professionally, it was like, well, we've got nothing to lose here, so we might as well go all in and give it a shot and take a big risk. Ironically, as we got more successful, what we found was the shareholders got much more risk averse. We used to say they were getting vertigo at the share price. When the share price would get too high, they would suddenly be like, don't do anything, don't break it, don't. They're like, oh, you're killing what we were by kind of putting these constraints around us.
Did you ever have any doubts personally about your ability, of course through the team, but your ability to turn it around?
All the time.
Right, okay, different question. When did the doubts stop? Or haven't they not?
So I think it was probably about 3 or 4 years in, and I thought, it's not luck anymore, is it? It must be working. But up until that point, I think I was like, well, have we just got lucky? Have we just got lucky? Have we just got lucky? And I was like, actually, maybe this is beginning to work. I think as a leader, personally, I never stopped questioning my ability to lead. We did, some of you in the audience who know the story of Future will know, we did a very difficult acquisition at the very beginning of the pandemic, like the week after the pandemic. And
was that TI Media?
It was TI Media, and I actually offered my chairman my resignation about a month after we did that, because I didn't think I was going to win it. I didn't think I was going to make it work, and I didn't want it to become about me. I wanted it always to be about the business, and I thought this has become immensely personal for some people in the organisation, and maybe the easiest thing is for me to step aside to let this deliver. Fortunately, he decided not to take it, and success is easy with hindsight.
Talk about the strategy and the thinking. Did you? I'll put it in very simplistic terms. Did you start from where Future was and where you thought it might be, or did you work backwards? That's where I want to get it to, and I've got to put in steps the process.
So we did two things. First of all, we were properly bootstrapped. No one was giving us any money, and the bank were not giving us any money. So whatever we did, we had to be able to afford to do ourselves. And so it was after you've paid the rent and the wages, and you've paid the bills, what's left over to invest. And so every decision then became very much, how do we manage the risk in there, and how can we do that? So in thinking through that, what we thought about was, we needed to have balanced cash, because quite frankly, great businesses go bust because they don't manage cash. And so we needed to make sure that we had an events business, because people pay in advance for event tickets. So that would give us money in the bank. We needed to make sure we kept pushing the subscription business, because people pay in advance for subscriptions. The advertising business, people pay 90 days later, so we needed to see if we could try and negotiate payment terms there. So we thought about, how do we diversify the revenue streams, thinking about the different payment cycles there to allow us then to think about how we would manage our growth, because if we didn't manage that, then we wouldn't be able to grow as the business expanded. And then because of what had happened, and the business had been amazing, but had been very long on one distribution channel being print, And of course that had gone wrong, and it had been quite long also on games and tech, and games had gone through a cyclical downturn at that point. I was like, I don't want to be exposed to a business channel, a product line, and I don't want to be exposed to an industry, because then my fate isn't in my hands, our fate is in someone else's hands. So we looked to think about how could we diversify our customer base, but also how could we try and have more distribution of kind of ways in which we could get the content into the hands of people who would be prepared to pay for it. So that was the kind of the initial thinking. And then after that, it was then about, I think Amazon, someone's been telling me, I'd met recently who works at Amazon, is telling me about, it's called working backwards. I was never that sophisticated. She's like, where do we want to get to? And then what do we need to do today to get there? So rather than thinking about, I want to grow by 5% this year, because then you become incremental in your thinking, we needed to be transformational. And to be transformational, you actually have to, I can't remember, Richard, if you were there at the time, but remember I was saying we were going to be the number one in tech in the US in digital audience reach.
And where was Future at that point, roughly?
Number 16 in the market metrics. It was just utter, bravado. And to use a Glasgow expression, I was being totally gallus. I was like, we're just going to do that. I had no idea how we were going to do it, but it's like, if we don't start thinking like that, we're going to get from 16 to 14, think we've done a great job, but nothing's going to have changed in our business. Whereas if we get to 5 and not number 1, that will be transformational for us from where we are today. Now, in the end, we did get to number 1, and it was amazing. But we thought very much about where do we want to be, and therefore, then what do you have to do to get there?
And at least in part, the strategic turnaround has been, or was, acquisition-based. So a strong program of acquisitions. There was very definitely organic growth and focus. But talk about that, about how you approached acquisitions in terms of, of course it's a combination of what's available, what's achievable, what the value is, etc. But how did you get for want of a better word, shopping list or a target?
Yeah, and so I think that we very much the view, which is we shouldn't acquire businesses unless the core business was in good health. So we had a kind of internal rule, which was if we weren't growing 10% internally, don't buy anything, because you're buying stuff and bringing things into your business when you've already got a problem. So you're adding complexity on complexity. And I smile at this because everyone was like, well, how big's your M&A team and which consultants did you use? And I was like, the M&A team for 8 of the 10 years was me and Penny, the CFO. And we've got one guy who works with us and a graduate. And we used Richard a very little bit at the beginning when he was Hippo Frog. But outside of that, we didn't use any consultants because no one knows our business better than us. And if we're going to buy something and we're going to put it into the business, then if the business hasn't got the capacity to do the work on the acquisition, it certainly hasn't got the capacity to do the work on the integration. And so if we don't care enough about spending the time to get to know the business we're trying to acquire or businesses we might want to acquire, then how are we possibly going to bring them into our organisation? How are we possibly going to realise the benefits? And so we very much did it internally, and we had a one-pager of, back to this point about diversified content. So was it different audiences? So we wanted to get back cycling, which we did, which was very pleasing. But building out new categories. And then we had diversified products. So could we buy businesses that would increase our subscriptions base? Or could we buy businesses that brought in B2B skills to our business? Or could we buy businesses that had events? And then we had a list, and then we had geographic as well. And so that was kind of, and we were like, well, what can we afford this year? Not a lot. But if we buy this and this and this, in 3 years' time, we can afford that. So let's go and get to know these guys so that when they think they might want to sell their business in 3 years' time, they know who we are. And that was kind of how we went about it.
I think it connects with the piece that Alex Lloyd did earlier for Burgess Salmon about when selling a business. In many cases, when you sell a business, you probably know your buyer already because your buyer is going through much this sort of process of courting from an early-ish stage onwards.
I think...
or at least getting to know, if not courting.
I think we did 25, and I would say 15 we originated in-house. We had always had a view, which was we wanted to buy those businesses, and maybe 10 came from other people who could see the opportunity and the connections.
We began EntreConf today talking about how you finance a dream, how you fund a dream. Something that doesn't exist, you've got to persuade someone to stump up a bunch of money. You had a different challenge. Of course, money was part of it, but it's persuading the board and also the shareholders that this course of ambitious, arguably aggressive acquisition was actually the right course. How did you go about that?
Honestly, that was probably easier because I think everyone at the board and the shareholder level was kind of, well, this is equity, take a risk, if that makes sense, and there was not a lot to lose. It was probably harder organisationally because, although Future had historically been formed out of some acquisitions, it was very proud of its identity. And so it was like, why are you spending money buying this company and not investing in us? And it's quite hard to explain to someone who works in AP or who is in a very junior position early in their career why it just doesn't work like that. You can't allocate money in those ways, and you have to kind of diversify how you do that. And so you can issue your shares to someone, but you can't spend cash you don't have in the bank. So some of that was just lost on people. So you really had to work hard at what are we trying to achieve? Why should you care? Why do these acquisitions enable what we're trying to achieve? And so part of that, for example, is we put in place this company profit pool. So that what we got the board to agree was, if we made profits over a certain number every year, then like the next, I'm making this number up, but the next 3 million would go to the staff, and it would be divided out equally. And what that then allowed us to do, not that everyone's motivated by money, but allowed us to kind of create this kind of one future about, like, it's not about your department, it's about our department, and if we're successful, you'll be successful too. And that, honestly, for a little while felt really powerful. And also from a personal point of view, I really believe that capitalism is great to a point, but people should share the opportunity, and we should share some of the upside because we share the risk. When businesses go wrong, people get laid off. And so therefore, when businesses go well, people should share in that. And so trying to kind of build a culture where people understood why we were doing things was what was the hardest bit.
Eat when the company eats. It's elements of that. You talk about risk. I'll give you some data on one acquisition which you did, which shows the sheer volatility of media assets. So what was IPC Media was you're very familiar with this, I know, had been bought by Time Inc. for 1.6 billion in 2001. In October 2019, you acquired essentially the same asset from a VC for 140 million. That's quite the swing. So when it comes to sort of value assessment, I mean, clearly you're not worried about what Time would pay. That's just gone, history, whatever. But given the volatility of media assets in particular, when it comes to valuation, how did you approach that?
It's a good question, and we really, really wanted those Time assets. And so what people don't know is that we'd been the overbidder that originally were those VC guys 2 years beforehand, and the seller at the time, which was TI in the US, were like, no, we don't like you because you're a public company. It will take 12 weeks to close. We don't want the risk. We're going to sell it to the VCs who can put money in the bank next week. So as we were just talking about, there's often a long time going on behind the scenes of trying to court the businesses that you want. We never put the revenue into the accretion models. So we always said, does this acquisition make sense based on the price we are paying and where we believe there are cost efficiencies? And so that where we believe we can grow revenues together, we never put into the model, because media is disruptive. It's just a disruptive industry, and if you don't plan for disruption, things to go wrong, you'll get caught out. So we were very, very conservative in our returns modelling to allow us to think about it. But our view was the value of the asset is what we believe we can do with it, not what the market says the price is that should be paid.
And indeed, primarily was about synergies and cost savings and so on. But that was a sort of a home acquisition, because it's a very familiar, albeit actually, certainly in the UK, probably larger business for Future was at that point in the UK in magazines. The away acquisition, to use those terms, I know you're a bit of a sports fan, was Go Compare. That for a media business to buy Go Compare valuation business, £600 million or so, which was viewed as, for some, as a complicated, risky acquisition, and also a bit toppy in terms of price. How did you look at that deal then, and what do you think in retrospect?
So what we realised was one of the superpowers of Future was we drive intent. We would write content that would help people make decisions, and that's why advertisers loved us, because we were close to the buying point, and that was why our affiliate e-commerce was so powerful, because the next step after reading our content was to go and buy something. So if you start thinking about us not as a media company, but as an organisation that helps people make buying decisions, then you start looking at other organisations that help people make buying decisions. And this comes back to wanting to be more diversified. And so we then looked at price comparison businesses, and in essence, our affiliate e-commerce business, the technology that we built that sit behind that is a price comparison database. It just happens to sit at the bottom of a piece of content. And so all that was different between us and the price comparison sites was we were using content as the marketing channel as opposed to PPC, which is what price comparison businesses were using. So we were thinking, well, that's a big diversification. We're great at writing content. Can we write content for their business to help them? So, and most people who know anything about PCWs know that the price comparison businesses spend about 80% of their revenue on marketing. And so we're like, well, if we can just save 10% of that, that's like a massive number. But also, if you go and buy insurance, you give a lot of information about yourself. You know, I mean, if you just think about, you know, where you live, how much you earn, you know, how big's your family. And in a world which was going down data protection and third-party data constraints, we're thinking, well, if we own that data and we can get it consented, then suddenly that makes our media asset much, much more valuable. And so we can take all that rich data about that you give through the PCW, and so long as you've consented, we can put that into our data platform, which then allows us to then do better targeting for the advertising. So, for example, we had a campaign running for people of a certain age who were looking to do equity release mortgages. Now, the only way we could know how to target that was people who had certain loan to values on their houses, which was part of what they're putting into their insurance, in certain postcodes to certain age groups. But by having, and there wasn't probably anyone else in the UK who could have targeted that from a media perspective based on the data profile we had. So that was the thinking behind it, and I, 100% stand by the theory.
There sounds ought to be a follow-up question. Yeah, but and the reality?
And the reality, I think, was, I think when we did that deal, it was a couple of years ago. I think it was about a year after COVID, I think, and the market hated it. So the lesson here was, I thought my shareholders were on the journey with me, and I thought they knew, and I was like, but I said this at the Capital Markets Day, and they're like, yeah, but it was on one slide at 1 minute, you know. So there was a real lesson there around, and so suddenly we went out to do our results presentation with great numbers and this great acquisition, and I was like, high-fiving all the way, and literally watched the share price plummet as I was talking, thinking, oh my God, and this was a share deal, so it was only going to go through if the share price went back up to, it had to be £19 for it to work. So that was like the 24th of November or something. So between then and Christmas, I did 100 shareholder meetings. So I literally went and met every single shareholder that we had in person, trying to explain to them why this was a good deal, because we needed to get them across the line for this deal to work. So it was incredibly stressful. And then because it had been so stressful, shareholders just had this kind of thing about it. So it became like an overhang on the business, like a question mark about what we were trying to achieve. I think then as we went in properly into the pandemic and everything that happened around that, so March was the beginning of the pandemic, this was the November of the same year, we probably lost 18 months on that acquisition because honestly, things were distracting. It was a bit hard just keeping the ball moving. Yeah. But I still think it's a good deal. Yeah.
At this point, still think it's a good deal. Let's throw it open to questions. We've got, Claudia's got a couple of mics. There's one over this side perhaps as well. So let's go for, and each time of course say name and company. Yeah, thanks. And indeed if you've got some sort of future links, I'm aware you have, so yeah.
Yeah, so.
Is it working?
I'll repeat it.
The light's on, yeah.
There we go.
So, Ian Robson, complete confession, I worked at Future for 10 years, and then set up my own business 8 years ago as that media thing. I can remember when you started, I remember the first week that I remember when you were CFO, but I also remember when you became CEO, and in the first week, you did a town hall around all the different buildings in London and in Bath, and there was a phrase you used, which was the first signal, I thought, that there was going to be proper instrumental change within Future. And you were referring to the digital magazine business and the revenue opportunity, and you used the phrase, it's a rounding error. And I just remember the impact it had on all the team in that room. And I just remember there were loads, and I was the head of the tech group at the time, and there were loads of people coming up to me afterwards. And I said, you're on a journey now. And I was leaving just a few weeks later. And I couldn't have realized the opportunity to be really human and personable with people and a no bullshit artist with people. And so the question is, how much were you able to be that person on that whole journey without all the bullshit of shareholder agreements and the city and everything else getting in the way, how much of that came through and delivered what you wanted to have as a vision?
So it's a good. I was waiting to see what you were going to say there because there were so many things you could have said that I said. Right, I was like nervous.
Go.
Yeah, I think, and this is important. As if you're an entrepreneur, something. One of my expressions is be careful what you wish for, because sometimes you get it. And in the early days, no one cared. It was an opportunity. It was like go for it. It was genuinely equity and risk and high reward. So you could really be yourself. And I knew a lot of people by their first name. I could walk the office and know the jobs that they did, and it was very intimate. By the time I left, and one of the reasons why I decided to leave, I hardly knew anyone. Everyone had everything I said, particularly in this society just now, was would offend someone. I remember sitting on one town hall, and I said something as a turn of phrase about getting your business into good shape, and I thought, oh my God, I'm going to get a whole lot of complaints about being discriminatory by that comment, because that's how it had become. And then the press in the UK doesn't like success, likes to take you down, and so it was always like, I'm earning too much money, I'm being overpaid, and therefore you would then have all those conversations as well. And so by the time it got to the end, honestly, I didn't love it, because it was all about, am I doing damage? Am I going to say the wrong thing? Am I going to get the business into trouble? Am I going to upset people? As opposed to, are we just going to do something really fun? And are you on this with me? Am I going to have a laugh? It became about being much more corporate.
Put it another way, was it harder? Two factors. One, as a public company rather than a private company, and two, as a woman rather than a man.
So people always say to me, public versus private, and I'd spent the previous 10 years in private equity with 3 different private equity businesses, backed businesses, and I'd lost money, made money, and came out with my neutral on those 3 deals. So I know the feeling of those. I don't think I don't actually think your capital structure matters. I think your business plan matters and your approach to it, because there are pluses and minuses. We could never have done the acquisitions that we did if we hadn't been in the public market. But the cost of that was I had to go out each half year and deliver a set of results, and I had to keep that momentum and keep that confidence. And so you understand the trade-off. But outside of that, we had huge freedom to operate. The board were immensely supportive, whereas in private equity, I'd have had them every month wanting to create 100 pages of spreadsheets, right? So there are definitely pluses and minuses. In terms of being a woman, I honestly, I don't know, because I only know it from what it was like from my vantage, which is always having been a woman. But I think that I'll tell you a funny story, and maybe this helps explain it. I have a very diverse team, and it's not because I planned it, it's because I believe in a meritocracy, and I believe you hire the best. And I think that we all have personal lives, and we try and accommodate it, but I also think that you have an employment contract. So you have to do the job, but we should, if you need to go to a sports day, we shouldn't be seen as being, coming off the boil for that. Forget, the working from home stuff just now that came through the pandemic. And I was hiring a role, and I remember thinking, oh my goodness, it's another woman. And I went to my chairman and I said, I need to just check this with you, because if I hire this means that we will be 75% female on the team, and I'm worried people are going to start saying I'm like a pro-feminist bitch, right? And I don't know that very many men would think that about their team. They might think we need to make sure we've got balance, but I was worried I would come across as being I'm only for the women, as opposed to I'm for everyone. And I think maybe that's the only story I can tell, which maybe helps to bring it to life.
To that point. Thank you. Some more. Is a question right at the back? So we take the one at the very back, then come to the third row here in the front. Keep you moving, Claudia. Do we have another mic, by the way? Actually, can we use this one as well? Okay. So can we come to the woman in the middle, please?
Hi, my name is Chin Tan. Thank you for your talk. It was very inspiring. I have a question about the way you allocate capital. So when you first took over, money was tight, so you prioritize things like event subscription. Did that change over time? And how do you think about allocating capital over your journey?
It's a great question. I don't think we actually officially thought about a capital allocation policy until about 3 or 4 years ago. And my CFO and I had to go away and look up and understand exactly what we were talking about there, because we hadn't thought about it as a kind of theory, if that makes sense. What we'd come at it more was kind of from a business perspective. So our fundamental view was cash on cash. You know, if I invest cash, can I make more cash back? And we kind of had a kind of 3-year horizon, because media is so disrupted. If I have to wait more than 3 years, I don't know what's going to happen. So if I can't get my returns in 3 years in media, it's probably too risky for me. And then what we were just looking at was absolute cash returns, because our business had been so bootstrapped. Cash was always going to be top trumps. At the same time, we had this kind of 10% earnings accretion principle, which was a bit of a kind of public markets thing to talk about. But we were really very much more focused on our job was to put money to work to grow the business, not to give shareholders back their money. And so we were always thinking about where can we see growth opportunities rather than can we return money as a kind of dividend stock.
Thank you. Towards the front, yeah.
So speaking about a future you can be excited about, I think a lot of us will resonate with some of the stories you told about kind of a toxic workplace dynamic and a stressful meeting, meaning you're kind of pulling leaves off trees in a park. And that's driving people out of entrepreneurship. I think you said yourself you might be going to Tesco. So kind of building on your previous comment, how did you prevent that toxicity and stress and maybe even trauma kind of leaching into the next business, and what can we do as businesses and investors and communities to prevent that in the future?
Well, that's a brilliant question. So I think, and I'm smiling because I'm sure some people would say that I create some of that toxicity and I create stress for people. And I don't say that jokingly, I say that being fully self-aware of the impact that we have, because what freaks me out might not freak someone else out. And what I think is straight talking might feel for someone else really blunt and make them feel defensive. And so my advice to anyone leading teams or working in teams is to be really explicit about how you work and explain your style. So that I always say, look, I always play the ball, not the man. So this might sound really harsh, but it's never personal. And if you think it's personal, tell me, and I'll stop you worrying about things that you shouldn't be worrying about. But I'm not going to sugarcoat it, because I believe in the sporting analogy that good athletes have coaches to tell them how to do their job better. So if we want to be the best, then it's not for me to sugarcoat this, it's for me to tell you how to be better. But you must know it's always from a position of good intent. It's because I care. And so I think properly contracting is really important that people understand that, and that you are therefore authentic. Also then saying, I'm not everyone's cup of tea. And nor is someone else my cup of tea. And so being clear about, is this an environment I want to be in? Is this how I want to work? You know, before I joined Future, I had worked in a really male-dominated environment, pre-Auto Trader as well, actually. And I was like, I can't be doing with this macho stuff, right? Where it's all like, you know, let's go down the pub later, and who could drink the most and then get up the next morning and, you know, show up. And I just was like, I haven't got this. This is not what I want to do. I don't want to be here. I want to go and find an organisation that feels true to me. And so I think that don't be afraid to say, I'm good at my job, I just don't want to work in this environment. But that doesn't make that bad. It just makes it not right for you. And it doesn't make you bad. It just makes you really clear about what works for you. And so I think that would be a really strong point, which is why, you know, for me, with Future the size it is just now, I just thought, I'm just not sure I want to be that type of CEO. Someone else might, and that's brilliant, and it's still a brilliant business, but it's not what wakes me up in the morning and gets me excited. And I think then, in terms of personal resilience, you know, this is going to sound trite, people need to sleep. And if, you know, when you're feeling stressed, the first thing you should check is, are you sleeping enough? Because nothing makes us make better decisions than getting enough sleep. And then diet and exercise. And I know it sounds so old-fashioned, but it's true. You know, and I think we all know when we're not eating well, we're not getting any fresh air or doing any exercise, and we're not sleeping properly, we are, you know, maybe not showing up as our best selves.
And you're a big fan of a burst of sports in the morning, typically. Is that just talk a little bit about, and then you carried that into business. You had the Future team out running, the sort of management team, and doing a 3 peaks.
Yeah, in fact, literally this weekend, about 5 years ago, the management team, we did the 3 peaks together, and we took our business coach with us. This tells you a lot about me. To watch us under stress, to let us, so that we could then have a coaching session afterwards about how well we worked as a team as we went up and down the 3 peaks. And we didn't manage to do the 3 peaks. The weather was atrocious. We had a few injuries. It was really quite a brutal experience.
Sounds great.
Yeah, it was. It was. We had a proper falling out coming down Snowdonia.
Team
In fact,
bonding, management experience.
we
brilliant.
went down as 2 different groups. That's how good it went.
Oh, fabulous.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh.
But we were better for it.
You might say that. But just on that, and not at all speaking personally, but for those who are perhaps physically less fit, how did they respond to it? Shit, I can't do that. What are you making me run up that hill for, let alone 3?
And that's a brilliant point, because it's about the contracting again. Does everyone want to do it? So more recently, with a different leadership team, we wanted to go and do something away from the day job. And one of the team said to me, well, I've got an illness, which means I can't exert myself in a way that, the rest of the team want to. How do we accommodate it? So we went to the Peak District for a walk. And but the idea was still the same, which was to go outside, but a completely different pace. Let's not make this about, how fast can we do this or how competitive, but just like, can we go for a walk in nature for a day to then make us talk and walk and think about things differently. And I think that's that point about telling people what is actually going on for you, so then they can help make sure that we are inclusive for each other.
Tell why, be clear, be fair. There was a question, I think, the 4th row back. Yeah, you've got the mic if you go.
Hi, and well, first of all, huge congrats, and I'm sure this is just the beginning of your journey. So in terms of, I think you mentioned you had 25 acquisitions, right? So my question is, how do you align all those different cultures and all those different companies and people and visions into future? And or more specifically even, or second part to that would be, your core team, so whether that be your management team or your C-suite or whoever is in what you would consider your core team, how do you specifically, I guess, again, align your vision with them?
I think at one point in my team, there were more people who'd come through acquisitions than there were who I'd hired or who'd been at Future originally. And so I think that you walk the walk. If you say we really want to integrate, then if you acquire someone who's got a great C-suite level person, why would you not have them in your team, right? And so we were very transparent with that. And then we would do this annual conference, and I would say, put your hand up if you joined Future as Future. And by the time I'd left, it was about 15% of the people in the room. And so what you realised was everyone understood that actually everyone here had a different way in which they turned up. And so you're acknowledging all the difference, and you're acknowledging the fact that we'd all had a different journey into this organisation, but could we understand what we were trying to achieve? And so the real purpose, sense of values, I was never afraid to keep repeating the same thing about, what we were trying to achieve, what our values were, what our strategy was. And then again, that point about, I would say to people, if it's not for you, that's fine, you can leave. It's not a threat, but don't feel you need to stay. But we're really honest about what we're about, and we'd love you to stay, but stay because you want to, not because you feel, you're here because under duress, if that makes sense. But it was always the hardest thing with the people. Every single acquisition, for lots of different reasons, always the people was the hardest thing.
Yeah. David, yeah. Yeah.
David Lester's founder of HR now, but sold a couple of magazines, Future and Past, 20 years plus. And also current shareholder, by the way, so thank you, one of you.
Hang on, this isn't insider trading, is it? Let me just clarify. You're well through all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think it's a really good example of why, and I'm smiling because, again, I think Richard knows this, I didn't know what a publisher was when I joined Future. I didn't understand it because I'd never been in media. AutoTrader is a different type of media based. And I was like, what is this job title? And so I was like, can we just not call it publishers? Can we just talk about what it is actually like what happens? So the reason why I said that is because I think you bring people in from other industries, you see other opportunities. And so AutoTrader, by the time I'd left, was the last place you went before you went to buy a car. You no longer went to forecourts. You did it all online. You did your research, then you went and bought a car at the garage you decided you were going to buy your car at. And I thought, well, why can't Future be the same? And so that was where we got the idea about, there was already a nascent idea around affiliate e-commerce, and there was a small team working on it. But I was like, oh no, this is going to work, because that's what happened with the cars. and at Auto Trader. So we just need to really get behind this, because you're making it easier for the consumer. I've done my research. Now you're going to give me the best price, and I can all do it without leaving the site. I actually think today affiliate e-commerce is the print magazines of 15 years ago, right? And I think media is going through the next stage of disruption again, and I think the combination of the economic environment that we find ourselves in, the privacy constraints we find ourselves in, and the growth of retail media networks and advertising is moving advertising dollars to a different place. And so consequently, I think that media companies really need to think about what is the next thing. Now for me, ironically, I think it's about paid consumer content, right? So things always come back in full circle, and so I really do personally believe that the subscription side and the ability to, people will pay for good quality personalized content. I think that to me is kind of the next wave, but it's not that I think it's declining, but I'm not sure it's got the same growth that it had before.
Yeah. We are running over time, but I've personally found it so fascinating, so I've let it run. So we'll take one more question here and perhaps one other, then we'll can it.
Hi, thanks very much for the captivating talk. My name is Shane. I worked at Future as well for many, many years, but didn't have the privilege of working under you. I wish I could. I wish I did. I went on to creative agency where Future was actually a client for many years, so I have a lot to thank Future for. Until I launched a cosmetic business a few years ago. That's a different story. So I'm really interested to hear, because you were a finance background to start with, and as a CFO, and from my personal experience, I watch my cash on a daily basis, and you touched on how important it is to have the cash flow in a healthy state. I literally can't live without my FD, and I wonder whether you feel like your CFO background has really helped you deliver the success you have achieved, or whether you think that might have been something that, how much contribution did that actually give?
So I'm also a massive music fan as well as a sports fan, and there's a Deacon Blue song called Chocolate Girl, and there's a line in it where it says, Alan doesn't understand her, he only thinks in numbers, and that's how I think of myself, right? And actually, I literally can't help myself but kind of go through the numbers first. So it was actually a hindrance, I think, because business isn't just numbers, but it's a really important part of it. So I went away and did a degree in behavioural change for 3 years in 2013, because I wanted to understand what motivates people, so that I would have both sides of it, because I think it's the complementarity that you need. And so I needed to train my brain back into, okay, the spreadsheet says it's this, but if I can't take people with me in the journey, it's never going to happen. So how do we win the hearts and minds? How do we do that? And I think you need both. And so if you've got a great CFO, that's a really great compliment. My CFO, I've worked with on and off for about 17 years. She is I was listening to the radio this morning, she's like, I'm like the positive and she's the negative on the battery, right? You need each other, but we're totally different. And it's about complementarity in terms of how that works.
Question towards right here. Have you got your hand up? Yeah.
Hey, hello. You mentioned in a previous point about repeating the strategy and where you're going many times. Did that strategy evolve? And if it did evolve, how did you manage that change of direction that you were bringing to the team?
So there was a business called Booker Cash and Carry, is run by a guy called Charles Wilson, who was just an absolute genius in terms of what he did with Booker. And if you went and looked at how he built his business, it was exactly the same strategy every year. And he prided himself on, these were the 3 C's that he would build his strategy on. And I had a huge respect for what he'd done there. And so we built a strategy that could adapt, but fundamentally it was the same thing. It was diversified revenues. It was organic growth. It was acquisitions where it turbocharged our strategy. What those diversified revenues might be changed, what those acquisitions might be changed, but the fundamental pillars always stayed the same. And underpinning all of that, having come from where we come from, was, and this is I think a really important point, is if you aren't successful economically, you don't get the freedom to make the choices about what you do with your business. Someone else will take those decisions for you. And so our view was we had to be successful financially, even if it wasn't always the things we wanted to do first, because that freedom allowed us to do the things we wanted to do and gave us the freedom to choose. And we had nearly lost that when I joined, and that was what was really important to us.
Thank you. One last, and I've got a composite question for you on a personal front to end with. We're going to go straight to the, okay, yeah, Andrew, right at the very front. Run to the front to Mr. Sparring. There we go.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Andrew Sparring from JAS Building Services. I'm also a business coach for Action Coach. Truly inspirational. What you've done is just absolutely mind-blowing to, I think, probably all of us in the room, to be fair. But what advice would you give to us from startup to large businesses to really go after our vision to achieve all of what you've achieved in a way? You've clearly got a lot of knowledge, and you're very objective in terms of your perception of things. And you mentioned you had a coach. I'd be interested to see what part that played in your journey.
Yeah, so I think that, think in numbers, I think that if you want to be successful, you have to be able to see that you have a cash flow. Not a profit, a cash flow, because that's what allows you to get by every month. So that'd be my number one. The other point then of that is, I think, have people around you who will tell you what they really think. You know, you don't need people who say who are going to, you know, be sycophants. What you need is people who are going to tell you, you do know that's barking, or, you know, this is where you should actually really go. So surround yourself with some really good advice.
So on a personal front, you've formally left Future, having signalled it maybe 12 months, certainly 6 months out. At the end of March you left, yeah. You've taken on a position as a non-exec chair of MC Saatchi, the world's biggest creative agency. So composite question is this. One, what are you seeking to learn from and contribute to MC Saatchi? Quite a dissimilar business to anything you've done previously. Two, would you ever be a CEO again? And three, related to the second question, would you ever imagine going to a much, much smaller business or even starting your own business? Lots of questions.
Yeah, great questions. So life's taught me to never, ever say never, because there's no such thing as absolutes. So I don't know if I would be a CEO again. I need a break from it right now because I'm a bit burnt out. So I just need a bit of out that zone. I've actually got a collection of non-executives, including M&C Saatchi, and I'm really enjoying that because some are pre-money in terms of not yet, you know, really small businesses, and one of them is a big, massive cruise liner in the US listed in the S&P 500, and I love the breadth of thinking, and I love the breadth of people I meet, and I love the, you know, just the kind of, it's just so interesting. I was just saying to Richard, M&C Saatchi is fascinating. I know nothing about media agencies, and I'm just really enjoying learning about it and asking all those stupid questions like, why do you know all these companies? Why have you got an office in India? You know, like, when you know nothing, you can really ask the dumb question legitimately, and it's really interesting sometimes how people answer it. So I'm loving that. And the last part of that was, would I start? You know, I'm not sure I'm brave enough to. I mean,
you're not brave enough to.
You know,
Honestly, of all you said, that's the one no one buys.
Yeah, so I work with 3 founders just now, and I have so much admiration for founders because you start with a blank sheet of paper, and I don't know how you do that. I really don't. I've always gone in and made something, taken someone else's idea and built around it or crafted it. But that kind of, I just don't know that I'm good enough at anything to think I'd be good enough to start something, whereas I think I'm good at optimizing, if that makes sense. My husband has a little shop, so we have an entrepreneur in the family, but I don't think I've got the guts for it.
Well, Zillah, honestly, I'm deflated by that very point. My flabber has never been so gasted as that very last point. That notwithstanding, I do think you've covered so much ground here. You've been so candid, inspirational, open. You've told a story which I think is deeply inspiring, this transformative approach, the energy, the drive, but I think the candor as much as anything else, the sheer openness of this. On everyone's behalf, I'd like to thank you for your time and your contribution to EntreConf. Zillah Byng-Thorne, thank you so much. Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you very much.